Let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into the global smartphone sales data for the first quarter of 2025.
Right.
And wow, the big headline that just jumped out of the sources we looked at, market reports from TechSpot, CNET, Canalys, even discussions popping up on Reddit,
Yeah.
is that the base model iPhone 16 was the world's single top-selling smartphone model in Q1 2025.
That really is a genuinely significant finding. Like, Counterpoint research data pointed out, and TechSpot and ZDNet picked up on this. It's the first time in 2 years that the standard, the non-Pro iPhone model has actually taken that top spot globally.
Exactly. Usually it's been like the Pro or the Pro Max leading the charge.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really try and understand why. Why did the base iPhone 16 pull ahead this quarter? What factors, according to these different sources, contributed to it becoming, well, the most shipped phone model on the planet in early 2025?
Okay, so to ground us, let's first look at the overall market picture. Canalys data shows the global smartphone market had a pretty modest Q1 2025.
Modest, yeah.
Yeah, shipments were 296.9 million units, but that was only a tiny 0.2% growth compared to last year. Really small.
And Canalys points out that growth has actually slowed down for the third quarter in a row. They think part of it is the end of that, what they call the peak replacement cycle.
Right, where everyone finally upgraded after holding on.
Yeah, exactly. And also, vendors are being maybe more careful, focusing on managing their inventory levels now.
Makes sense. And looking at the top manufacturers by sheer volume, Samsung still led the way in Q1. They shipped 60.5 million units. It's about 20% market share.
Okay.
Apple was a close second, though, with 55.0 million units, grabbing 19%.
And then Xiaomi came in third.
Yep, Xiaomi third with 31.8 million units, 14% share, and then Vivo and OPPO filled out the top 5.
Right.
Canalys also noted some, interesting regional stuff. Some markets like India, Latin America, the Middle East actually saw declines. Europe dropped too. But then you had strong demand in places like mainland China, maybe helped by government subsidies there, and Africa saw growth too. So a mixed bag regionally.
Okay, so that's the big picture, the top brands.
Mm-hmm.
But let's zero back in on a specific iPhone 16 base model win. Because despite Samsung leading overall volume,
Right.
it was Apple's standard iPhone 16 model that was the individual bestseller. TechSpot and ZDNet really hammered this point home from the Counterpoint data.
It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? For 2 years, you just assumed a Pro model would be number one.
Yeah.
And now, boom, it's the foundational model. It suggests something kind of shifted maybe in what people are buying or why they're buying it this quarter.
So it's important to say Apple is still, incredibly dominant in that premium space.
Absolutely.
The reports highlighted that 5 iPhone models were in the global top 10 bestsellers list. And that's for the first quarter in a row.
Wow, 5 years running in Q1.
Yeah, and the iPhone 16 Pro Max and the 16 Pro were right behind the base model. They were second and third globally.
Exactly. TechSpot mentioned the Pro variants still accounted for nearly half of all iPhone sales.
Okay, so almost half.
Yeah. So it's not like people stopped buying the expensive iPhones. It's just that the base model saw this exceptional growth spurt to grab the very top spot.
Okay, so let's get into it. What did the sources say were the key drivers? Why did the base iPhone 16 surge to number one? Let's dive into the why.
Well, it looks like several factors kind of came together, almost like a perfect storm for the base model. One big thing is just Apple's consistent global appeal, right? The brand, the ecosystem strength TechSpot pointed at it.
Ecosystem lock-in, yeah.
Totally. And CNET went a bit further, saying this data really suggests that maybe a non-Pro model of the iPhone is what most people want, fundamentally.
That definitely clicks with some of those Reddit discussions we saw. You know, users debating how much the average person really needs, like the absolute highest specs versus just wanting that reliable iPhone experience. iMessage, FaceTime.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Another huge piece was specific regional growth. TechSpot highlighted the iPhone 16 base model did especially well in Japan, the Middle East, and Africa.
Oh, interesting. Specific regions.
Yeah, and in Japan, they mentioned better economic conditions and new carrier subsidy rules, helping the base model specifically.
Subsidies.
And Canalys added that Apple's overall growth in Q1 was really pushed by emerging Asia-Pacific and the United States. The U.S. market itself grew a healthy 12% year-on-year in Q1, and Canalys basically said, yeah, that was mostly Apple.
That U.S. growth is definitely key. Okay, and what about the economy? How did that play into things?
Both CNET and ZDNet suggested that the sort of current economic conditions and an overall reticence to spend a bit of caution, maybe?
Yeah, makes sense.
That likely pushed more people towards the base model instead of, shelling out for the more expensive Pro versions.
That totally tracks. I mean, the price
Yeah.
jump between the base 16 and the 16 Pro, it's not small, is it?
No, it's significant.
Especially if you're a family getting multiple phones, or like some Reddit users said, businesses kitting out employees. When money's tighter, that price gap looks even bigger.
Absolutely. And tied right into that price thing were the carrier deals.
Ah, yes, the deals.
The Reddit threads were full of this people talking about really attractive trade-in promotions from T-Mobile, Verizon, others. They basically made the base iPhone 16 and even the new 16 incredibly affordable. Like, they cut that upfront or monthly cost way down for a lot of customers.
Yeah, so you've got maybe economic pressure pushing value,
Hmm.
carriers making the base model super tempting.
Yeah.
What about just what people actually use their phones for day to day? Did the sources touch on that?
Yeah, those user discussions gave some good insight there. It seems for many, maybe most average consumers, the base model just does the job.
Right.
They care about the core stuff,
Yeah.
iMessage, FaceTime being reliable, a camera that's good enough for snapshots, solid battery life.
Things that just work.
Exactly. Those high-end features like, the 120 hertz promotion display or MagSafe charging, they're nice to haves, not must-haves for this big chunk of the market. So the base model hits that sweet spot of capable and more cost-effective.
It really underlines that disconnect sometimes, doesn't it? Between what tech reviewers get excited about and what actually drives mass market sales.
That's a great point.
Uh-huh.
And speaking of different market segments, we absolutely have to talk about the impact of the new iPhone 16.
Ah, the 16, right.
It only launched partway through Q1, but TechSpot reported it shot straight to the number 6 spot globally in its first full month.
Wow, immediate impact, number 6 already.
Yeah. And TechSpot thinks even though it costs more than the old SE it replaced, the 16 is probably going to sell better over time,
All right.
just because it's got better tech, more features. It helps Apple compete better in that upper mid-range category.
And what were the Reddit folks saying about the 16?
Some interesting angles. A few saw it as maybe a great phone for businesses, corporate use.
Oh, okay.
Maybe pricier than some basic Androids they could lock down, but you get the iOS management features. It's good for basic work stuff. So, appealing for enterprise.
That makes sense.
And for regular users, it looks like a solid upgrade if you're coming from an older, cheaper iPhone, like an 11 or an old SE, especially if you just want better battery life and for it to last a long time, and you don't need all the Pro bells and whistles.
Right. Just a reliable, modern iPhone.
Yeah. And one comment, kind of an interesting tidbit, claimed it had the lowest return rate in the wholesale trade. Suggests people who buy it are pretty happy with it.
Interesting. Okay, shifting gears a bit, what about the competition? How did others fare in that top 10 list in Q1?
Well, Samsung's big flagship, the Galaxy S25 Ultra, its ranking actually dropped compared to where the S24 Ultra was in its launch quarter.
Oh, really? Why?
TechSpot thought maybe it was partly just because it had a shorter sales window this year within Q1.
Ah, timing. Okay.
But Samsung's S25 series overall still did well, apparently. And interestingly, their mid-range phone, the Galaxy A16 5G, saw really significant growth. TechSpot said that was driven by it being available in more places, especially North America.
So Samsung's mid-range is strong too.
Yeah. And then there was Xiaomi. TechSpot and ZDNet both pointed out the Redmi 14C 4G was the only phone in the global top 10 that wasn't an Apple or a Samsung.
Wow, just one.
Yeah, that shows how dominant those two are. But the Redmi's strong performance, especially in emerging markets, really shows Xiaomi's continued strength in that value segment.
And that actually links to something else mentioned, right? The really low-end market.
Exactly. A broader trend the sources picked up on was the rapid growth of the low-end segment phones under $100. TechSpot and ZDNet said this was actually the fastest-growing category in Q1 2025, made up almost 20% of global sales.
Nearly a fifth of all phones sold were under $100.
Yep. Devices like the Samsung Galaxy A06, that Xiaomi Redmi 14C again. It's driven by demand in emerging markets, affordable parts becoming available. It just shows that for a huge number of people worldwide, price is still king.
So despite Apple's success with the base 16, there were still challenges and headwinds mentioned in the sources, right?
Oh yeah, definitely not all smooth sailing. Apple faced specific issues for its Pro models in China. TechSpot mentioned government incentives there are increasingly favoring local brands. Plus, Really intense competition from companies like Huawei is eating into Apple's premium share over there.
Right, the China market is tough.
And then there's just broader market uncertainty hanging over everything. Both Canales and CNET brought up the potential impact of anticipated tariffs, particularly the ones discussed by President Trump.
The tariff talk.
Yeah, that could add a lot of uncertainty, potentially hike up prices, especially for those more affordable phones coming into the U.S.
Which could hurt that fast-growing low-end segment.
Could do. Canales mentioned Apple is reportedly already shifting some production to India, specifically trying to maybe lessen that tariff risk for phones heading to the U.S.
Smart move, diversifying.
And just generally, McRumors and Canales agreed that economic volatility, trade tensions, it could all just make consumers worldwide decide to hold off on upgrading their phones for a bit longer.
Which, again, could actually funnel people back towards more affordable options if they do need to upgrade, right?
Yeah.
Like the base iPhone 16 or the 16.
Exactly. It kind of circles back to that idea we touched on, the gap between what tech enthusiasts focus on, the specs, the new features, versus what actually drives sales volume when people are feeling cautious about spending.
Yeah, that Reddit discussion comparing the initial kind of lukewarm tech reviews of the iPhone XR years ago.
Right. Everyone focused on the screen resolution or whatever.
And then it became this massive bestseller. It feels relevant here when you think about the 16 or even the base 16 success. Market wins aren't always about having the absolute bleeding edge specs.
Well said.
So, bringing this all back to you, the listener, when you see the base iPhone 16 taking that top spot globally, what does that tell you about what's really driving the smartphone market right now?
Yeah, think about how things like the economy, what's happening in different regions, those carrier deals, and just what people actually value day to day, how all that shapes these trends. Sometimes it looks quite different from the headlines just focused on the newest, flashiest features.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, the iPhone 16 base models rise to the top. In Q1 2025, it wasn't just one thing. It really looks like a combination, right?
Yeah, definitely a mix.
Apple's core brand strength, the ecosystem pulling people in, then that targeted growth in key regions, plus a tricky economic climate making value look really appealing.
Those aggressive carrier promotions making the price right.
And the new 16E doing its part, grabbing a different slice of the market, it all came together.
And here's maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Given how much economic caution and potential tariffs seem to matter in these reports, does the success of base models like the iPhone 16 and that whole surge in the low-end market, does that signal a more permanent shift? Are people moving away from always needing the absolute top-tier flagship, or is this just, a temporary reaction to how things were in early 2025?
Something to think about indeed. We really hope this deep dive gave you a clearer picture of the smartphone market dynamics this past quarter.
And hey, if you're interested in checking out the iPhone 16 yourself, we've put a link for you down in the description of this video.
Yeah, check that out.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this analysis, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives.
Your support really helps us keep doing these.
It absolutely does. And again, you can find that link we mentioned for the iPhone 16 right there in the description below. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.